And that's a big takeaway here. How easy something seems to do and how people see it plays a big role in how behavior is spread. Think about trends or fashion or even political movements. They take off because someone or something makes them seem easy to understand or desirable.
It makes you think about the super spreaders in our own lives, right? The people or things that have influenced the choices we've made or our behavior. Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're looking into tipping points and some fascinating group dynamics. You've given me some super interesting stuff to dig into this time, some excerpts from Malcolm Gladwell's book, Revenge at the Tipping Point, and also some really interesting data too.
And Gladwell kicks things off by presenting us with 3 scenarios. On the surface, they seem totally different.
Yeah, so like puzzle number 1 is, why did LA all of a sudden become like the place for bank robberies?
Right. And then puzzle number 2, what is it about Miami that could make a businessman who seems successful get caught up in some Medicare fraud?
And the last one, puzzle number 3, is about what could have caused a bunch of teenagers in this like idyllic town to try to commit suicide.
Yeah, so these puzzles don't seem connected at all, but by the end of this deep dive, you'll totally see how Gladwell brings it all together.
All right, so let's start with puzzle number 1 then. We're heading over to LA in the 80s and 90s when bank robberies in the city just exploded. It got so bad that the FBI was overwhelmed. They were getting new reports like every few minutes.
And what's crazy is that this wasn't thousands of people just randomly deciding to rob banks. It was a small number of people who were not only robbing banks themselves, but also inspiring others to do it too. They're what you would call super spreaders.
Super spreaders. Like a virus.
Exactly. Yeah. Gladwell uses that virus analogy to explain how behaviors and ideas can spread through networks. And sometimes you have these few people who have a huge impact.
So who are these bank robbery super spreaders then?
Well, there was this guy called the Yankee Bandit. He hit 64 banks in just 9 months. So that's like 2 bank robberies every week.
Wow, that's a lot. But I think you mentioned an even more interesting case, Casper and Sea Dog.
Yes, these 2 were something else. They actually orchestrated something like 175 robberies, but never even went into a bank themselves. They were the brains behind it all, recruiting and training teenagers to do the robbing for them.
Wow, so they were like the puppet masters of bank robbery. It's wild that they stayed hidden for so long by using teenagers.
It took the FBI forever to figure it out and build a case against them.
So where does Willie Sutton fit into all this? He was that famous bank robber, right? Didn't he rob the banks himself?
He did. But what's interesting is that both Casper in the 80s and 90s and Willie Sutton decades earlier, they both had this ability to inspire copycats. They made robbing a bank seem easy, and to some people, even glamorous.
Yeah, it is kind of disturbing. Just like a virus, then ideas and behaviors can be contagious. And these guys were like the carriers spreading this bank robbery bug.
And that's a big takeaway here. How easy something seems to do and how people see it plays a big role in how behavior is spread. Think about trends or fashion or even political movements. They take off because someone or something makes them seem easy to understand or desirable.
It makes you think about the super spreaders in our own lives, right? The people or things that have influenced the choices we've made or our behaviors without us even knowing it.
That's right. We're going to be looking into that idea more as we go through these puzzles. But for now, let's switch gears and head down to Miami for puzzle number 2. This is the story of Philip Esformas. He was a successful businessman, but ended up convicted of Medicare fraud.
This one is confusing. This guy seemingly had it all: money, family, success, but he ends up running one of the biggest Medicare fraud schemes ever.
And it's super weird because this all seems to happen when he moves to Miami. Gladwell argues that Miami itself, its history and culture, may have played a role in his downfall. He calls this The overstory.
Overstory. Okay, I'm listening, but what does that even mean?
Okay, so think of it this way. The overstory is like this invisible landscape that shapes the world around us. It's everything, historical events, cultural norms, those unspoken rules, how power works, and it all comes together to influence how people behave and make choices.
Okay, so what's Miami's overstory then? And how did it affect Philippus Forums?
Gladwell points to 1980. That year, 3 big things happened that basically changed how Miami worked as a society.
What were those 3 things?
The first one was the Mariel boat lift. A ton of Cuban refugees came to Miami. It put a huge strain on the city's resources and also created a lot of cultural tension.
And then there was the whole cocaine thing, right?
Yeah, Miami became a central spot for drug trafficking. Money and corruption were everywhere.
And the third event.
Miami had some really bad race riots that year. Trust in the system basically eroded and social tensions got even worse.
So 1980 sounds like a really rough year for Miami. But I still don't see how this is connected to Medicare fraud.
Think about it this way. These 3 events happened so close together, it's like a social earthquake hit Miami. All the normal rules and power structures were shattered. It created this environment where the lines between right and wrong got blurred.
So in this crazy environment, someone like Philippus Formes could do really well, even if it meant doing illegal stuff.
Exactly. Obviously, we're not saying what he did was okay, but Gladwell is suggesting that Miami's overstory, all this upheaval and changing norms, might have created this situation where S. Formes' choices made sense to him.
So it's like the city itself was contagious. It made risky behavior seem more acceptable. Kind of like how Casper and Sea Dog made bank robbery seem almost normal.
That's a great connection. Now think about the overstory of your own city or town. What are the historical events, the unspoken rules, the cultural forces that are influencing how people act and make choices?
That's an interesting thought. We don't usually think about how much our environment shapes how we see things and what we do.
And that's the power of understanding these overstories. It helps us see the world differently. But before we get too deep into that, let's move on to our last puzzle for today, the Poplar Grove effect.
Yeah, this one really got to me. Poplar Grove is this perfect town, wealthy, safe, good schools. But underneath it all, there's this dark side. All of a sudden, a bunch of teenagers tried to commit suicide.
And the weird thing is that these weren't isolated incidents. It seemed like despair was contagious and was affecting all the young people in town.
It's heartbreaking to even think about. So what's Gladwell's explanation for this?
So he draws on research from sociologists who studied Poplar Grove High School. They found that, unlike most high schools, Poplar Grove didn't have that usual variety of social groups.
You mean like the jocks, the nerds, the drama kids?
Exactly. Those groups might seem silly, but they give teenagers a sense of belonging, their own identity, and different ways to navigate the social scene.
So what was different about Poplar Grove High?
There was just one big group. Everyone was high-achieving, driven, and focused on success. There was no space for anyone who didn't fit in to feel accepted or find support.
So like a social monoculture, everyone trying to achieve the same narrow definition of success.
Exactly. And Gladwell brings up this comparison to cheetahs. Scientists found that cheetahs don't have much genetic diversity, so they get sick really easily. They can't fight off even minor infections.
Wow, that's a powerful analogy. So are you saying that the social monoculture in Poplar Grove made the teenagers super vulnerable to mental health issues?
Exactly. They didn't have different social groups, so there were no cultural antibodies to protect them from negativity or give them different perspectives.
It's sad to think that the things that made Poplar Grove seem perfect, everyone being the same and sharing the same values, might have actually contributed to this awful situation.
It makes you think, and it raises a good question for you. What kind of crowds do you see in your own life, in your work, your community? Are these groups encouraging different ways of thinking and experiences, or are they more like a monoculture?
That's a great point. We don't usually think about how the groups we're in affect how we feel, both individually and as a group. It makes you think if monocultures can be so bad, how can we create more diversity and make ourselves stronger in our own lives and communities?
That's a really interesting question. But for now, we've unpacked these 3 very different puzzles. They show us how individual actions, cultural forces, and social dynamics can all come together in surprising ways, and often with results we don't expect.
And we've only just started. I'm already thinking about all the hidden connections and unseen forces that are shaping our world.
And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to look at how people are purposely manipulating these tipping points, using social engineering to try to change behavior on a massive scale.
Now that's something I don't want to miss. See you in part 2. Welcome back.
So we've seen how individuals and the places we live can be like super spreaders. shaping behaviors and even leading to some pretty unexpected outcomes.
Right, and now we're kind of flipping things around and looking at how people are actually manipulating these tipping points on purpose. It's called social engineering, and it's being used to influence what people do on a really big scale.
Social engineering, that sounds kind of scary. Like, is it always a bad thing?
Not always. Like anything, it can be used in good ways or bad ways. Think of it as nudging people towards certain actions or results.
Okay, so can you give me like an example of social engineering happening? Well, Gladwell starts by talking about a sociologist named Rosabeth Cantor. She studied how group dynamics totally change based on the ratio of minority to majority members.
Right. Cantor's skewed proportions. That's where that whole magic third thing comes in.
Exactly. Cantor found that when a minority group hits a certain number within a bigger group, that magic third, it triggers a huge shift in behavior and results.
So it's not just about having diversity. It's about having enough diversity to reach that tipping point where things actually change. That's so interesting. So how does this magic third work in the real world then?
Gladwell gives some pretty convincing examples. Let's take corporate boards, for instance. For years, they were almost all men. But as more women joined boards, researchers started noticing something they called the woman effect.
So boards with women on them were more collaborative and asked harder questions and made better choices?
Yeah, but here's the thing. The woman effect only really started happening when the number of women on the board reached a certain level. Research actually shows that boards with 3 or more women on them, that magic third, are totally different compared to boards with just 1 or 2 women.
So that one extra person, that third woman, can totally change how the entire group works. It makes you wonder if other groups are missing out on reaching their full potential because they haven't hit that magic third.
It's definitely something to think about. And it's not just gender either. Gladwell talks about this other cool example, Damon Centola's naming game experiment.
Oh, yeah, that's the one where people had to come up with a name for something online, right? But some of them were secretly trying to get the group to choose a different name. So what happened? Did those secret people manage to influence the group?
Only when they reached that critical mass, again, that magic 25%. If those secret voices were less than 25% of the group, they had zero impact. But as soon as they hit that 25% number, the group's decision would fall apart and everyone would switch over to the name the secret people wanted.
Whoa, it's like a social domino effect. Once they reached that tipping point, nothing could stop their influence. It reminds me of how we were talking about bank robbery earlier and how easy it seemed because of people like Casper and Willie Sutton. But this time, it's ideas that are spreading and hitting that magic third is how they become powerful.
Exactly. And this same idea might even be happening with tough social issues like the racial achievement gap in schools.
How so?
There are studies showing that if minority students make up less than 25% of a class, the achievement gap stays the same. But if there are more than 25% minority students, you guessed it, that magic third, again, the gap basically disappears.
So just by change the mix of people within a group, we could actually make things more fair. That's a powerful idea.
It really is. But it brings up some serious ethical questions, too.
Yeah, I can see that. If we can use this to engineer social change by messing with group dynamics, who decides what those changes should be? And what about people's individual choices? It seems like a slippery slope.
You're right, it's tricky, and Gladwell uses the story of the Lawrence Tract to show this. It was supposed to be this planned interracial community in Palo Alto back in the 1950s.
I think I remember reading about that. What happened?
The people who started Lawrence Tract really wanted integration, but they were also scared of white flight, which was happening all over the U.S. at the time.
So they were trying to build a community that was diverse and stable.
Exactly. And to do this, they made all these rules, all these proportions to try and keep the racial balance in the community just right. They were very careful about who they let buy homes there.
That sounds a lot like social engineering. Like they were trying to control the community to get the result they wanted. It was for a good cause, but it still feels kind of iffy.
It definitely raises questions about how far we should go in manipulating social stuff, even if we're trying to do something good.
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
And it makes you realize that social engineering is happening everywhere already, probably in ways we don't even notice.
You're right. Think about the algorithms online that decide what we see, or marketing campaigns that target certain groups, even the way our cities are planned that shapes how we interact with each other.
Whoa, it's like we're all stuck in one giant social experiment. It's a lot to take in.
It can be. But Gladwell's point is that we need to be aware of these forces, to think critically about how they're shaping our lives, and to really consider the ethics of the choices we make ourselves.
So we've gone from bank robberies to corporate boards to racial dynamics in schools. It's crazy how all these seemingly random examples are actually all about this magic third and how we can change behavior just by changing how groups are made up.
It all comes down to understanding how powerful those tipping points in social engineering are. And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to see how these ideas can be used to rewrite cultural narratives and create social change on an even larger scale.
And we're back for the final part of this deep dive. We talked about tipping points and social engineering. But let's zoom out a bit now. Let's talk about cultural narratives, those big stories that kind of shape how we see the world. Can they reach a tipping point too and completely change?
It's like a total shift in how everyone thinks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gladwell uses this really powerful example to show the Holocaust.
It might seem weird to think about now, but, back in the decades after World War II, the Holocaust wasn't really something people talked about much. You'd see it mentioned here and there in books and movies, but nothing that really captured how huge and horrible it was.
And then in 1978, this crazy thing happened. The TV miniseries Holocaust aired.
Yeah, that miniseries was a big deal. Over 120 million Americans watched it. That's half the country. It was this 4-part series that told the story of the Holocaust through 2 families, one Jewish and one German.
It was so raw and emotional. And it really got people talking about something that no one wanted to talk about before.
And it wasn't just in America either. When Holocaust aired in Germany, it had a huge impact there too. It forced the whole country to face its past.
I can't even imagine. So how did a single TV show change the way everyone thought about this?
Well, it didn't shy away from the horrors of the Holocaust, but it also showed the victims as real people. It gave names and faces to those who were lost.
You couldn't ignore it anymore.
Exactly. And this brings us back to those overstories we talked about. Holocaust didn't just tell a story, it totally changed the overstory. It changed how people thought and talked about this horrible event.
It's mind-blowing that one show could have that much power.
It shows how strong storytelling can be.
It makes you wonder what other overstories are out there waiting to be changed. What hidden truths need to be exposed?
That's a great question. And it brings us back to those super spreaders. Remember we talked about them with bank robberies and viruses? Well, they can also be super important in shaping how ideas spread and how society changes.
You mean people like Rosa Parks? Her refusing to give up her seat on the bus started the whole civil rights movement. Or Greta Thunberg. Her climate strikes got young people all over the world involved.
Exactly. These people were so brave, and they became super spreaders of ideas. They tipped the scales for social change.
It's amazing to think that one person can make such a big difference.
It really is. But Gladwell also makes us think about a different kind of super spreader, Mr. Index.
Mr. Index, who's that?
He's the guy who spreads a virus without even knowing it. Maybe he doesn't have any symptoms, or maybe he just doesn't realize he's sick. But he goes about his life interacting with people and leaves this trail of contagion wherever he goes.
So like those people at that Biogen conference who accidentally spread COVID early on.
Exactly. It's a reminder that the super spreaders who have the biggest impact are sometimes the ones we least expect.
It's kind of scary, but it shows how connected everything is. We're all part of this big web of relationships, and what we do can have much bigger consequences than we think.
And that brings us to the opioid crisis. Gladwell says the opioid crisis is like a textbook example of overstories, super spreaders, and tipping points all happening at once. He talks about the Madden overstory, how California focused on making prescription painkillers harder to get.
So California's efforts created a different overstory then, like a whole new set of norms and expectations around dealing with pain.
Exactly. And because of this, California was what Gladwell calls a small area variation issue. Opioid use stayed pretty low there, even while it was going crazy in other parts of the country. But then we have McKinsey and Company.
What did they do?
Well, McKinsey, they're a consulting firm, and they worked with Purdue Pharma, the company that makes OxyContin. They wanted to help them sell more of the drug. And they did this by focusing on those super spreaders, again, doctors who prescribed a ton of opioids.
So they were going after the people who had the most power over who got opioids.
You got it. It's a classic case of using super spreading to get what you want.
But this time, what they wanted was to sell tons of opioids, and that had terrible consequences.
Yeah. And then to make it even worse, as those prescription opioids got harder to get, people turned to heroin and fentanyl, which are even more dangerous.
So they tried to engineer a solution to the opioid problem, but it totally backfired and made things even worse.
It just shows how complicated these things are. Even when people try to do good, there can be unintended consequences.
It's a lot to process. We've covered so much in this deep dive: tipping points, super spreaders, overstories, social engineering. It's clear that these things are always happening and shaping the world around us in ways we don't always see.
The important thing to remember is that we're not just along for the ride. We can be part of making things happen. When we understand these ideas, we can make smarter choices, fight for positive change, and maybe even become super spreaders ourselves. Spreading ideas and actions that make the world a better place.
What a great way to wrap things up. Thanks for coming along on this deep dive. We hope this sparked some new ideas and got you thinking. Until next time, keep exploring the world, and remember, even small actions can make a huge impact.
And that's the power of a deep dive.